Hello. My name is Reiko Hayashi from BofA Securities Japan, and I will be the moderator today. It was in November last year that our company changed to its current name from Merrill Lynch Japan Securities. We will hold tripartite talks on the TCFD disclosure and transition finance aimed at carbon neutrality. The three panelists are Mr. Kondo, Mr. Kuwata, and Mr. Kajikawa. Aiming for carbon neutrality in Japan is not just an environmental problem, but it also involves changing our economic policies and society itself. So it's an important issue that must be addressed by both the public and private sectors. Many people are taking part in today's seminar, testifying to the high level of interest in this issue. The Task Force on Preparation of Environment for Transition Finance began in January this year. It is of great significance that we are holding these tripartite talks today with the representatives from the three parties organizing the task force. Now, we would like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves along with their background. In their self-introductions, I've also asked them to talk a little about themselves personally. It will not be easy to attain our goals by 2050 through these policies. We hope that revealing some of the personal aspects of the people in charge of these important policies at the ministries and agency involved may allow seminar participants to relate more to their policies. Incidentally, our panelists today are not only all involved in transition finance, but for some reason, all their surnames start with the letter K. We weren't sure of the order of self-introductions, but we'll start with Mr. Kondo from the Ministry of the Environment. We'll also respond to questions from participants during the talks, so don't hesitate to use the chat function. Over to you, Mr. Kondo. Thank you. My name is Kondo. Can you display my slide, please? No? Okay. Can you see it? Only your face. Shall I introduce myself first? I'd like to see your slide too, if that's possible. This is new to everyone. I think you can start if you can display the slide yourself. Should I set it up myself? Can you start, Mr. Kondo? Okay. I'll try it myself. It's going to work. Thank you. I want to talk about the promotion of ESG finance by the Ministry of the Environment in terms of its disclosure and transition. First is a quick self-introduction. I joined the Bank of Japan straight out of university. Then I came to the Ministry of the Environment on loan in July last year. In the Bank of Japan, I was in charge of monitoring financial institutions and carrying out statistical surveys and laying down financial rules on leverage ratios, for example. Recently, I was involved in digitalization, fintech, and so on. Originally, I wasn't an expert on sustainable finance, but I was deeply involved in regional finance. I've included a photo of my sons in the slide. So now, I'll talk about the policies of the Ministry of the Environment, including transition finance. The Ministry of the Environment has always been actively promoting ESG finance. The three main pillars are: 1. The promotion of engagement in the financial sector based on commitment to ESG and disclosure of ESG information. This is most closely tied to today's theme because it's about promoting communication with the market. 2. Is the regional decarbonization. The decarbonization initiatives of major companies are under jurisdiction of the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, but we are covering policies targeting the demand side, including individuals, regions, and small to medium-sized companies. 3. Is the expansion of investing and lending with the aim of making an impact. In any field, what's important is to support financial products that prioritize the making of an impact instead of just any product. It was the Ministry of the Environment that established and promoted Green Bond Guidelines. I want to talk about these three pillars in accordance with today's theme. Can I have the next slide, please? First is 1. Our commitment to ESG and promoting the disclosure of information. The next slide. The Financial Services Agency and Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry are in charge of designing the TCFD framework and how it will be deployed by the government. The Ministry of the Environment supports the laying down of ESG policies by companies and promotes the disclosures. The details are on the next slide. It's called an Analysis Support Project. Support is provided through consultants on disclosing information based on the TCFD recommendations. We began this initiative with business firms in fiscal year 2018, and we've already achieved results. As you can see in the next slide, the initiative has recently been targeting regional financial institutions too. For example, in their case, quantitatively evaluating how the climate risk evaluation of a credit portfolio has a financial impact on them is a little more difficult than at business firms. We launched a pilot program with the cooperation of 3 local banks. Next are specific examples. You can look at the reference materials for more details. We identified the main industries with great effects on climate change and came up with scenarios for how factors affecting bank earnings would change. We examined the financial impact based on this. It was for the first time that we analyzed the scenarios with the 3 local banks and held discussions in environmental fields with the people in charge of finance. Our main issue was how to incorporate environmental risks in financial risks. Next, as I explained earlier, the Ministry of the Environment will support regional decarbonization. This will be carried out in coordination with the government as a whole. The government and local administrations cooperated in holding the second meeting in April on regional decarbonization. A roadmap was laid down at this meeting, and we also plan to provide financial support to local administrations in making their transition toward decarbonization. With regional financial institutions, we're running an ESG regional finance promotion program by assigning consultants to them. We provide extensive support to initiatives at financial institutions involved in ESG investing and so on. For example, in the case of the Hokuriku Bank, their region has carbon-intensive sectors such as aluminum industry. Under these circumstances, we worked with the Hokuriku Bank to implement initiatives with the aim of achieving decarbonization. We are not alone in implementing these initiatives, but we formed a team in cooperation with the Financial Services Agency, and we plan to continue our efforts based on our mutual know-how. There is also a need for investments that will make an impact, so we are striving to promote such financing. There may not be a need to give a detailed explanation of impact financing here, but I'd like everyone to understand that it's ESG investing that clearly committed to its effects. We see it as being an advanced form of ESG finance. So, how do we evaluate the impact? We published guidelines for evaluation impact in March this year, summarizing the evaluation methods and principles. Impact financing isn't limited to environmental issues, but since we're the Ministry of the Environment, we focused on green impact. The green bond is also an impact investment in a broad sense because it is accompanied by the commitment to green objectives. The Ministry of the Environment has been providing strong support to green bonds through subsidies to expand its market. The goal of the transition is to realize a green environment, so it is extremely important to develop the green market. We've established guidelines in other areas too, in our effort to develop the market that will eradicate the concerns of investors. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you. I've been told that Mr. Kondo makes an effort to commute to work by bicycle. I have great respect for your personal efforts to be environmentally friendly as a person representing the Bank of Japan. Next up is Mr. Kuwata from the Financial Services Agency. Can we have the next slide? Thank you for giving me this opportunity today. I'd also like to thank the people in charge of JPX and the staff of our agency for their cooperation. So, here are my materials. Can you see the slide? My name is Kuwata. I'm currently Director of the Policy Planning Office. Other than sustainable finance, I'm also in charge of growth strategies and the International Financial Center. After I joined the agency in 2004, I studied in the UK. Then, in the European sovereign debt crisis of 2011, I strived to gather all kinds of information for the mission of Japan to the EU in Brussels. After returning to Japan, I was placed in charge of international negotiations for total loss absorbing capacity, TLAC, for when banks went bankrupt and the finalization of Basel III. In 2018, I was loaned out to establish the Japan Investment Corporation. At the end of that year, for some reasons, I returned to the Financial Services Agency. Then I became involved in sustainable finance and the founding of TCFD Consortium, and I have held my current position since summer last year. As for personal information, I'm from Hirakata City of Osaka Prefecture. As you can see in the photo, I have 3 young daughters. I've never been so popular with girls in my life like I am now. In my student days, I worked part-time at a billiard hall. I even used to take part in billiard tournaments. I haven't had time to play billiards since I began working, and the only time I get to relax in daily life is when I go home and enjoy a drink while watching TV dramas. I never miss Shibusawa Eichi and other episodes of serial dramas. I was going to say my daily routine is making breakfast with my daughters, but my wife stopped me saying I shouldn't lie. The Financial Services Agency has set up the Expert Panel for Sustainable Finance to hold extensive discussions on carbon neutrality. Japanese companies have great potential for realizing decarbonization. The main objective of the Council is to examine what the government can do for financial markets to realize appropriate funding functions. The expert panel is being chaired by Professor Mizuguchi of Takasaki City University of Economics with the participation of Executive Vice President Konuma from JPX and today's moderator, Ms. Hayashi. This expert panel focuses on both long-term policies as well as what can be done immediately. In reality, social finance forms a part of sustainable finance, but here we will hold discussions with a focus on the vital issue of carbon neutrality. This is material from a meeting held the other day. Players gathered from companies, financial institutions, and financial capital markets, and discussions were held on the respective policies needed. Discussions are being held on what the government can do to ensure enhanced disclosures by companies, risk management, and support to borrowers by financial institutions, and vitalization of the sustainable finance market in financial capital markets. We'll delve deeper into these discussions in the future. Specifically, we recently called for public comments on revising the Corporate Governance Code. There is a growing trend toward prioritization of sustainability among investors in making their investment decisions, so the importance of corporate disclosures is growing. There is a trend toward the development of globally standardized frameworks of disclosure, which is comparable for investors and efficient for companies. The Financial Services Agency, too, are taking part in these efforts. Regarding climate change in particular, the TCFD is the leading framework. This has been achieved through public-private cooperation with the agencies and ministries involved. The Financial Services Agency has called for opinions from the public aimed at revising the Corporate Governance Code to make further progress. The Financial Services Agency supports companies to ensure the amount and quality of corporate disclosures in accordance with the TCFD recommendations or the standardized framework developed by the IFRS Foundation. Next is our initiatives in vitalizing the sustainable finance market. There are a variety of players in the direct financing market. Examples include the stock exchanges of various countries, such as JPX, co-hosts of today's seminar. The stock exchanges in London and Luxembourg in particular are actively involved in such efforts. For example, they have created a dedicated platform for ESG bonds, a data hub showing corporate ESG-related information on a dashboard, and tools for comparing and analyzing such information for the benefit of investors. As for the fostering of human resources and capacity building, they have been giving lectures on various topics through webinars and giving out materials on case studies and technical terms. The JPX ESG Knowledge Hub has been established at JPX2. We plan to hold discussions on improving quality and what to aim for in the future regarding this type of information sharing. In the future, green bonds and social bonds, as well as transition bonds, will be issued, and the vitalization of the market is expected to accelerate. To attract overseas investors in the future, there will be the need to consider developing a certification framework for objectively ensuring the eligibility of such bonds. Boosting the credibility of bonds will also lead to greater confidence in the market, so there's room for more discussion in attracting domestic and overseas capital. Furthermore, ESG valuation institutions will be key players in vitalizing the sustainable finance market. ESG valuation institutions are growing in importance with the global expansion in ESG investing. However, the lack of transparency in the evaluation methods used by such institutions has been pointed out by companies and people involved in the market. Examples include the lack of opportunities for communication with evaluation institutions on the details of their evaluations, and the lack of transparency in how investment decisions were made by investors upon seeing the evaluations. In the future, the importance of evaluation institutions will grow further, so we believe in the need for further discussion on these matters. Last, I want to talk about the promotion of sustainable finance and risk management by financial institutions. There is a high proportion of indirect financing in the Japanese market, so financial institutions play an extremely important role. financial institutions are required to support their clients' responses to climate change through engagements. It's important for them to make use of their consultation functions to contribute to the creation of business opportunities for their clients. Financial institutions themselves are also required to come up with solid business models in response to climate change. NGFS, an international network of supervisory authorities, has also been established, and we have been engaging in supervision of financial institutions in response to climate change risks. The rest is reference material. So that brings me to the end of my explanation. Thank you very much. Mr. Kuwata also lived in Europe, so I believe he has views on what is currently happening in the EU. We look forward to what he has to say later during the panel discussion. Next up is Mr. Kajikawa. Hello, I'm Kajikawa of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Please look at my slide. Can you see my slide? I'll talk about the global trend in climate change policies and the details of a task force on preparation of environment for transition finance by the three parties. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry has people on loan from private trading companies and banks. Personnel reshuffling is also carried out every 2 years. Furthermore, we've been implementing teleworking with the spread of COVID-19, so communication at the workplace has become mutually difficult. To improve this situation, we began an initiative to mutually share information on one another, so I'd like to share some personal information on myself. This is how I spend my days off. During the week, I spend time in a toxic environment at Kasumigaseki, so on weekends I spend time outdoors detoxing myself. I don't commute to work by bicycle like Mr. Kondo, but I enjoy immersing myself in nature with my family on my days off. I joined the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry straight out of university, where I've been involved in a variety of fields, including financing for small to medium-sized companies, IT, designing and human resources policies. These fields may seem unrelated, but I've been constantly involved in Japan's macroeconomic policies and growth strategies. My other pastimes include walking in the park at 5 a.m., doing yoga with my family, and other physical activities. My personal outlook on life is to keep sunshine in your heart. Work is always hard, but I strive to be cheerful and positive. It was mentioned before that all the speakers' names today start with the letter K. The expression 3K has negative connotations in Japan, so I wanted to change that by showing you this photo. I'd like to continue now on a more serious note. Please wait while I switch to full screen mode. Is it this button? I was taught how to do this just before. There are plans for numerous international events on climate change this year. At the Summit on Climate hosted by the US in April, Prime Minister Suga announced Japan's 2030 target for reducing CO2 emissions. A G7 summit will be held on June 11th in the UK, and there will be a G20 energy ministers meeting in July. Furthermore, there will be a G20 leaders summit in October and a COP26 summit in November. This is how a series of international events will be held, becoming a year in which various countries will bolster their initiatives to fight climate change. I've summarized the meaning behind the situation. We are aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050. Moreover, our goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 46% by 2030, while Prime Minister Suga announced we will take on the challenges of aiming for a 50% reduction. We have clearly entered the age of the great competition to realize a decarbonized society. 124 countries around the world have declared they will aim for carbon neutrality by 2050. Numerous summits will be held this year. Apart from the financial market, Apple and Microsoft have declared they will demand decarbonization along their supply chain. A great race has begun at all levels between countries, the financial world, and industries. These initiatives are driven by efforts being made by countries to maximize their national wealth. In Europe, these efforts are being spearheaded by governments, which in turn have vitalized the activities of citizens. For example, the European Green Deal was laid down as a growth strategy. The EU Taxonomy is being set as a standard for attracting private funding, while the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism to be proposed in June is expected to encourage the bolstering of climate change measures in various countries. The Trump administration in the U.S. didn't come up with any bold policies to fight global warming. But the industrial world, especially IT companies, has been tending toward decarbonization of entire supply chains. In the world of finance, too, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock Inc., declared his intention to bolster ESG in a letter sent to stockholders in April this year, accelerating the trend towards decarbonization. With the inauguration of the Biden administration in January this year, this trend has become more conspicuous, and we believe the government and the worlds of industry and finance have finally fallen into synchrony. China has announced plans to realize carbon neutrality by 2060 at the initiative of the government. They have been promoting the strategic spread of electric vehicles and renewable energy sources. They concurrently promote finance-related policies, including emissions, trading, and funding. Furthermore, they are ambitious for developing the ISO and other international standards. So what's happening in Japan? Japan is characterized by the implementing of initiatives through government-industry cooperation. Realizing carbon neutrality by 2050 is a growth strategy, and it also indicates progress in innovation. 14 priority fields were identified in Green Growth Strategy through achieving carbon neutrality in 2050, and a cost target for 2030 will be proposed in working backward from 2050. 2030 and 2050. I think there's room for debate regarding the targeted figures, but the role of the government is to first present a vision and establish an environment to encourage private enterprises in their challenges. Private enterprises will be the ones to actually implement innovation through investment and social deployment. The role of the financial sector will be to attract funds from around the world. In doing so, the aim is to provide financing for making the transition to decarbonization transition finance. In TCFD, Japan's initiatives implemented through public-private cooperation has won high appraisal from the TCFD Secretariat as proof of Japan's success. I think it's important for the public and private sectors to work toward a common goal. Let me quickly explain Japan's initiatives aimed at realizing carbon neutrality. We live in an age in which measures against global warming provide us with opportunities for growth. Our industrial policy aimed at realizing a positive cycle of economic growth and environmental protection is the Green Growth Strategy published in December last year. It's easy to say, but putting our ideas into practice is a lot more difficult. The industrial world needs to make fundamental changes to conventional business models and strategies. However, this is a chance to become leaders of a new era, and the government will provide full support to the challenges of private enterprises. The government will need to come up with a specific outlook and set high quantitative goals to make it easier for private enterprises to take on the challenges. 14 fields were identified in the Green Growth Strategy, and specific policies will be implemented in accordance with the roadmap in each field. Next is our vision for making a transition to carbon neutrality. It's impossible to make a society with zero CO2 emissions. First, we need to switch to non-fossil fuel-based sources of electricity. Other than electricity, we aim for decarbonization through complete electrification and use of technologies and synthetic fuels such as hydrogen, methane, and biomass. In areas not covered by these initiatives, we aim for carbon neutrality through tree planting and carbon removal, such as DACs. We believe transition finance is about providing credit to innovation and business models that will appear in stages between 2030 and 2050. As stated in the Green Growth Strategy, it is important to guide private funds and promote transition finance. It's based on an understanding of this stance adopted by the government that I want to talk about the importance of transition finance, which is the main theme of today's talks. I think you're all aware of the importance of the EU Taxonomy, which I mentioned earlier during my explanation of the trend within the EU. This is a classification system for clarifying whether economic activities are sustainable or unsustainable. It then provides funding for activities that are deemed sustainable. Interest is being focused on what will happen in the future to industries that are deemed unsustainable. However, a decarbonized society will not be achieved by dividing industries in such a binary way. In actual fact, some industries can quickly making a transition to carbon neutrality, and other carbon-intensive industries will need to make the transition in stages. For example, materials industries such as steel and chemicals sectors cannot avoid emitting CO2. So, how can industries with no alternatives reduce CO2 emissions? The concept of transition finance has been developed with the aim of providing support to such industries. Japanese companies have a wealth of transition technologies such as saving energy or energy conversion, as well as technologies for disruptive innovation, including those for electric vehicles. We envisage a system in which companies make investments and funding is provided to these technologies. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry has been engaged in discussions since September last year. This led us to come up with TGIF, which stands for Transition T, Green G, and Innovation I combined with Finance F. Furthermore, the importance of transition finance has been recognized in the green growth strategy. With this in mind, the three parties are currently organizing the task force to promote this transition finance. The task force coordinates with the expert panel on sustainable finance hosted by the Financial Services Agency. The task force is formulating the basic guidelines on climate transition finance based on the Climate Transition Finance Handbook by the ICMA, International Capital Market Association. As you can see in the schedule, we began these meetings in January this year, and opinions have been exchanged with a variety of organizations and companies. Then, we made a public call for opinions in April. We're no longer doing this, and now we're sorting out all the gathered opinions, which will be publicized as early as during May. I'd like to thank Moderator Hayashi for her cooperation during these meetings. Next are the main points of the basic guidelines on climate transition finance. The guideline basically serves as a reference for business firms, securities firms, banks, evaluation institutions, and investors in financing for decarbonization. It provides support to fundraising, particularly for carbon-intensive sectors faced with technological and economic cost issues. The guideline lays down the general provisions. It doesn't provide green classification frameworks for individual industries. For example, it doesn't indicate that coal-fired power generation is unsustainable while LNG is sustainable. It doesn't indicate the classification of individual investment targets. The key is to examine holistically the reliability and transparency of transition strategies adopted and deployed by companies aiming for decarbonization. So, during labeling, necessary investments may be made based on assets or an evaluation of the strategies deployed. However, the strategies must be proven to be based on scientific evidence. Under the Japanese version of the policy, specific NDCs, nationally determined contributions, consistent with the Paris Agreement and roadmaps for different industries have been laid down. And whether a case constitutes a transition or not will be judged upon referring to these roadmaps. This will allow not only major companies, but also small to medium-sized companies to acquire funding. This fiscal year, we'll prepare roadmaps in various fields centered on carbon-intensive industries. We plan to decide on the specific industries for creating these roadmaps in the future. But they will be industries that emit large quantities of CO2 and have no short-term alternatives for decarbonization from financial or technological viewpoints. They'll also be centered on industries in which a transition is believed to be of great importance. The roadmaps will be prepared by the competent authorities of respective industries. As an example, a roadmap was created in March last year for the shipping industry by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport with relevant industry groups and experts. The Ministry of Trade, Economy and Industry is considering to create roadmaps for industries involved in energy industries such as electricity and oil, and material industries such as steel and chemicals. That brings me to the end of my speech. I think Mr. Kajikawa's outlook on life to keep sunshine in your heart is ideal for a person involved in energy policies. We look forward to talking to you again later. So let's move on to the panel discussion now. We received a question before asking whether we will provide materials on today's talks. The Secretariat will make a PDF file available for downloading at a later date. We ask you to make use of this. So let's begin the panel discussion. First, I have a question I'd like to ask as an icebreaker. Mr. Kajikawa, can you turn off your slide now? I'm actually trying. Okay, first, I want to ask you a question just out of interest. As an ordinary citizen, I'd like to know what kind of insights you've gained through discussions and cooperation among the people from the three parties while working toward a shared goal. Can you tell me as much as you can about your honest feelings? So, we'll start with you, Mr. Kondo. Before I start, I have something to tell you. The trouble we had before with my slide wasn't the Secretariat's fault. It was my mistake, and I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. As for your question, people are affected by others around them. At the Ministry of the Environment, we spend a lot of time with experts on environmental issues, so we tend to get influenced a lot by the views of such people. But when we talk to people from the financial sector, we have to adjust our thinking to their rules, so it makes you realize the differences. However, the entire world is made up of people with different views and perspectives, so I think it's good to make decisions through negotiations instead of deciding everything by one party. Making adjustments costs a lot, but I think it's worth it. Thank you. I'm sure the Secretariat is also relieved to hear your confession at the start that it wasn't their fault. I'd like to ask Mr. Kuwata the same question. You told us about your way of unwinding, giving us an idea of how stressful your work is, but how was the experience? Thank you for your concern, but I was just kidding. During this time of great change in the structure of the economy, it was highly meaningful to hold discussions on transition finance among three parties. It was government policy for the related ministries and agency to work on this together. This was necessary to launch a social movement, and working in solidarity was good. Working for the Financial Services Agency, I spend a lot of time with people from financial institutions. But cooperating with the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry brought me into contact with many people from the industrial world. People have different ideas depending on the type of industry they work in or the size of their company, and it made me acutely aware of the differences in their awareness for and interest in carbon neutrality issues. Then going back to talking with people at financial institutions, I realized they have an awareness of the situation in their clients' industries in a different way. Bringing all of this together will deepen the discussions mutually. That's how I felt, and it's made me want to continue these efforts. The Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry played a central role in this initiative. How did you find this, Mr. Kajikawa? Did you experience any difficulties? It wasn't just me, but all three parties held detailed discussions in great depth. Our job was to summarize these discussions. In doing so, we also had the help of external organizations like ICMA. As all three parties knew their assigned roles, and we worked together in organizing the task force and laying down the basic guidelines on transition finance. Frankly speaking, I think it's important for all parties to engage in discussions using their expertise. Transition finance is the issue where all our expertise overlap. This is not simply about finance, but it's an important policy that will determine how carbon-intensive industries will change. On the other hand, how much should carbon-intensive industries be prioritized? This is where the Ministry of the Environment will get involved. Furthermore, as far as financial measures go, how much should we expand the market for corporate bonds? This is where the Financial Services Agency will get involved. It's important for these three areas to overlap in order to maximize value. The government is criticized for its vertical organization, but it's important for experts to cooperate with one another only after working on their own and aiming for a common goal. I think we managed to achieve this through our Transition Finance Initiative. Listening to all three speakers has made me realize that you engaged in discussions and managed to cooperate with one another based on your different but complementary perspectives. Next, I want to ask about information disclosure. Before, Mr. Kuwata abbreviated the term Corporate Governance Code to CorpoGover. In accordance with amendments to CorpoGover, you stated that the amount and quality of information disclosed should be raised by companies listed on the prime market based on the TCFD recommendations or equivalent international standards. Japan has the world's largest number of TCFD supporters, which has been called Japan's success. But realistically speaking, some companies would be reluctant to show their support because of the time and cost involved. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Kuwata, as a person involved in amending CorpoGover? I use the term CorpoGover without even thinking about it, and I just realized it's not a standard term. The code was amended to deal with the prime market that is about to be set up. The companies have yet to be chosen, so the number is still unknown. But we will be recommending the TCFD disclosures to companies that choose to be listed. Stocks listed on the prime market will have the advantage of being those of companies with a higher standard of governance, so we hope more companies will work on the TCFD disclosures. The code is based on the principle of comply or explain, so companies should comply with the respective principles, or if they don't, they must explain their reasons to stockholders and clients. This system has won appraisal from the business world because it maintains voluntary and flexible disclosures for companies. But as you say, it takes time and is costly. The problem is that climate change is a long-term phenomenon with many uncertainties. So, frankly speaking, companies are not sure what they can do in taking its effects into consideration. First, companies should set scenarios as preconditions for effects climate change will have on them. In doing so, it's difficult to ascertain the long-term and uncertain elements, such as future demand for energy and regulations. After determining the scenario, you have to analyze the relationship between climate change and the company to identify the effects. But developing the methods to do this is difficult. Even after analyzing the effects of climate change, when the company decides to aim for decarbonization, it's unclear what will happen and what they should do. Many companies become reluctant because of these obstacles. A certain amount of time has passed after the laying down of the TCFD framework, but there are still no clear answers. But we must forge ahead no matter what difficulties we face. The Financial Services Agency provides best practices of corporate disclosures. It engages in discussions on better disclosures in the TCFD consortium. JPX also publicizes information on how information should be disclosed through JPX ESG Knowledge Hub. Companies can make use of such tools, and through learning by doing, it's important that they make progress one step at a time to acquire the understanding of investors through engagements. I have great expectations for the efforts made by companies. I agree that there are no clear answers regarding the disclosure of information. I'd like to ask Mr. Kondo if he has anything he'd like to add from the Ministry of the Environment's perspective. I agree that there are no clear answers. The Ministry of the Environment advocated the importance of environmental reporting even before discussions on climate change have been heating up. The TCFD disclosures are aimed at investors, so it differs slightly from environmental reporting, but we're happy to hear similar arguments in the business world. However, I can understand the difficulty of making progress due to the numerous uncertainties involved. But the financial market is connected globally, so this issue is unavoidable. Progress has to be made if companies are to deal with global investors with high awareness of environmental problems. On the other hand, it's a fact that information disclosure is a corporate strategy and not simply an obligation to investors. So companies will need a double-edged strategy in which they avoid spending too much on basic information while investing in information that they want to strategically promote the disclosure of. That's my opinion as a person from the Ministry of the Environment, as well as the Bank of Japan. We provide support in disclosing basic information aligned with the TCFD framework and hope that companies will take advantage of this to disclose their strengths strategically. In the future, we'll extensively publicize best practices of disclosures and provide support in the gathering of useful data. The gathering of data is tied to advances in technologies, and demand for such data will increase if it became easier to gather information on CO2 emissions. In a way, the TCFD disclosure is similar to freestyle acting within the designated framework. In other words, what matters is how you present yourself instead of searching for an answer. It's all about how you can convince your clients and stockholders. The people in charge of environmental and financial issues are starting to hold serious discussions even within banks, and this epitomizes the overall situation. You should do this with investors outside the company as well. We'll provide support for the basics, so it's important for companies to concentrate on the strategic parts. Would the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry like to add anything to that as the host of TCFD Summit 2020? After many years of involvement in this issue, it's interesting to note that environmental initiatives have been upgraded from being a part of CSR activities to being an administrative issue. I think that's the biggest change that's taken place. It's the greatest effect that's been achieved by TCFD. The environmental issue such as climate change has become closely tied to corporate strategies, and it's been turned into a matter of how companies can create added value and how they can innovate technologies to achieve this. The TCFD created the opportunity for these changes. The TCFD scenario analyses extend to 2050, but the management plans of companies normally extend only 3 years or 10 years at the most into the future. The TCFD calls for looking 30 years into the future to see what they can do. As such, the initiatives implemented will form the foundations for the creation of medium to long-term value that will extend beyond the addressing of climate change. On the other hand, it's true that information disclosure will require time and cost. During the TCFD summit, it was proposed that companies should start with information that can be readily disclosed, then decide what to do next upon communicating with investors. This is similar to the learning by doing principle I mentioned earlier, in that companies should start with what they can do immediately and gradually raise the quality of disclosures. I think many people are relieved to hear today that they don't have to aim for perfection from the start. I think discussions will be held on quantification and KPIs, so I look forward to hearing the discussion later. Now, I want to talk about transition finance. I believe the discussions in this area were prompted by talks in Europe. According to media reports, I believe the debate is ongoing in the EU as to whether gas is sustainable or unsustainable, and no conclusions will be drawn until the end of the year. It revealed the differences in opinion within the EU, but what is Japan's stance on transition finance? According to the discussion of the Task Force on Preparation of Environment for Transition Finance in March this year, we aim to make the deliverables of the task force acceptable overseas. I'd like your comments on how we can deepen understanding among people involved in the market, including those overseas, and how this will lead to the flow of funds. I'd like to ask everyone in the opposite order now. but please keep your comments brief because we're running out of time. I think the European Commission's decision to postpone the drawing of a conclusion on natural gas and nuclear energy in their taxonomy was due to differences in opinion within the EU. The circumstances surrounding energy within the EU as a whole and within individual countries differ, and there are a variety of opinions even within the industrial world, revealing the EU is not monolithic. We will continue gathering information, but we can't make any predictions at the moment, so we have to keep a close eye on the situation. In Japan, transition finance isn't about judging whether certain facilities are suitable for providing funds to. The basic idea is to provide financing for initiatives needed to implement their strategies or change their business models for achieving net zero emission by 2050 or 2030 goal. If a company decides to use natural gas, it must indicate how it intends to realize decarbonization through its use. For example, it can indicate how much CO2 emissions can be reduced by co-firing natural gas with ammonia. There's no need to set accurate quantitative targets by 2050, but it's important to explain the strategy behind the switch to a decarbonization business model based on technology. The EU Taxonomy conclusion on natural gas is of great interest, but in Japan, companies will come up with decarbonization strategies which will be judged for their appropriateness for financing. Then, they must continue efforts to ensure financing. What about you, Mr. Kondo? The Ministry of the Environment agrees. You may think there are no green indices, but for example, there are indices for green bonds, and we try to keep costs down for due diligence. On the other hand, rather than classifying the scope of transition finance clearly, it is more important whether or not investors can judge corporate strategies as being worthy of investment in aiming for decarbonization. There are many uncertainties, and there's room for debate on the benefits to the market in determining whether natural gas is sustainable or not, while companies lay down strategies aimed at 2030. I'd like to keep a close eye on the market before deciding. But I basically agree with what Mr. Kajikawa says. I think debate on the categorization of energy to determine what is sustainable is unavoidable in the financial sector. How does the Financial Services Agency feel about this? Can we hear your thoughts on the matter, Mr. Kuwata? There are always conflicts of interest among the 27 member states of the EU. As a shared agenda, the climate change issue has areas in which everyone agrees, and that's been the driving force behind the EU sustainability initiatives. But as for the details of what is green and what is not, the conflicts of interest among the member states of the EU have stood out, and I think they're in for the long haul on this. This is my personal opinion, and not my agency's view. But I think the power of private enterprises will become important from here on. I don't agree with the idea of governments laying down detailed rules and standards. I don't think the imposing of government-set standards on private enterprises is an effective way to allow them to give full pay to their potential. It's somewhat questionable when you think of the sustainability of the market. We too lay down policies and engage in discussions on sustainable finance, but we believe in the importance of prioritizing private enterprises to allow them to give full pay to their potential. The key to the success of transition finance in Japan lies in how we can attract overseas funds. Doing this will require a roadmap, so that's what we'll focus on. We must take the conditions in Japan into account while adhering to international standards. It's most important that we create an internationally trustworthy roadmap. Next is carbon neutrality. The age of the great competition was an expression that was used before. I think this is a truly appropriate expression in light of the fierce competition, including differences in national policies between the US and China as well as Japan. What are some examples of the success you have achieved so far, and what are the main issues for the future from the perspectives of your respective ministries or agency? I'd like to start with Mr. Kuwata. Climate change is a long-term issue with many uncertainties. In the age of the great competition, it's important for the government and companies to strive toward becoming a role model, leading others as best practices. But they also need to focus more on promoting the initiative locally. I want to talk about a successful initiative I was involved in. The TCFD consortium was established in May 2019. After that, we talked with various financial institutions and companies, which resulted in Japan overtaking the US to become the country with the world's largest number of TCFD supporters. This was very encouraging, and it also boosted Japan's overseas reputation, becoming touted as Japan's success. The result was that overseas countries now seek Japan's opinions regarding TCFD. So I think this is an example of our success. As for promoting the initiative locally, financial institutions or regional financial institutions in particular recognize the need to do something for climate change or ESG investing, but don't know exactly what to do or how to do it. I heard that the administrators of regional financial institutions began issuing in-house orders around the end of last year to do something about it. You can't make progress in initiatives like these unless the orders come from the top. So it's a step forward knowing that the administrators are motivated. The problem now is whether the people on site can keep up. There are two things financial institutions must do. One is what financial institutions must do themselves, and the other is what they must do for their clients. The former involves laying down a strategy, identifying the sectors for financing and investing in, and so on. The latter involves dealing with clients, and that's what we are prioritizing. When a private enterprise launches something based on ESG, they first consult their main bank because hiring an external consultant is expensive. Regional financial institutions have always provided management consultation services through asset analyses of their clients, comparisons with competing companies, and so on. So, the issue now is to enhance their consultation services and provide their clients with similar advice on decarbonization. I work for a financial institution myself, and that's good advice. What about you, Mr. Kajikawa? A future issue of carbon neutrality is that different initiatives will be needed to be implemented for 2030 and 2050 goals because of the difference in the time span. We only have 9 more years until 2030, so we mustn't expect too much in the way of innovation by private enterprises. It's important that they deploy the best available technology, BAT. Funding will be needed for capital investment in energy-saving technologies, for example. So I think private enterprises will need to lay down strategies with financial institutions through transition finance. On the other hand, I see a need for social deployment of negative emission technologies by 2050. There'll need to be a framework for marketing these technologies. This won't simply involve the underground sequestration of CO2 through CCS, but there'll be a need for discussions on how value can be added to it in a decarbonized society. Companies will need to do whatever they can using current technologies until 2030 and strive for technological innovation while looking 30 years ahead. New technologies can not only be deployed domestically, but they can also be promoted overseas, including ASEAN countries, to benefit from overseas growth. This will help other countries deal with climate change while also allowing us to benefit from the economic growth in the region. Building such a model is our greatest challenge. Do you have anything to add, Mr. Kondo? The Ministry of the Environment has so far focused on developing the green market. This market has grown steadily, so I think we've been relatively successful in this area. But our biggest issue is what we can do in rural regions, as Mr. Kuwata mentioned. In reality, people living in cold regions are asking how they can get through winter without relying on kerosene. We can't achieve decarbonization in Japan without dealing with these kinds of issues. As it was mentioned before, the various support projects have made the administrators of regional financial institutions forward-looking, but it's actually the stockholders and individual depositors who have to do this. But they have a long way to go in grasping an understanding of decarbonization. In particular, obtaining the understanding of individuals is the most difficult part for us. It will require a completely different approach involving education and lifestyle changes. but I feel we have to enlighten people in order to promote decarbonization among the general population. So, how can we do this? We have ideas such as relying on crowdfunding, but we need to continue our search for other methods. I think we still have a long way to go. It's an issue that will need to be passed on to even your children. We've received many questions from the floor, but I have one last question. In the age of the competition with various countries, what do you think is important for Japan to exercise its leadership? I'd like brief comments from everyone in the reverse order. The Ministry of the Environment will promote circular economies throughout the world. This is because the technologies for recycling materials, including plastics, are relatively well established in our country. We hope to promote these technologies for making effective use of resources in aiming to realize zero emissions. The other thing is, Japan's strength lies in its industries that cover everything from upstream to downstream operations. As such, if we succeed in our transition, I think Japan has the capacity to contribute extensively to the decarbonization efforts of other countries and the world as a whole. Mr. Kajikawa, I talked about TGIF before, but as for the T for transition, I think Japan will succeed in establishing a market. As for the G for green, bonds have now exceeded 1 trillion yen. I for innovation is what we can expect next. But innovation at business firms is not enough. It'll be important to provide innovative financing in fields that financial institutions have so far been unable to deal with. For example, you can expect global demand for negative emission technologies, but no progress will be made if financial institutions simply said, "There are no revenue models and the risks are high, so we can't invest in such technologies." The next target is innovation, and the problem is how we can provide the F or financing for it. The methods deployed should be turned into Japan's strengths. Mr. Kuwata, I agree that innovation in financing is also required. So we too would like to work with the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry to pursue this. As I mentioned before, the government cannot impose its standards onto the market, but the market has to bolster itself. I think it's important for us to encourage financial institutions to proactively support the new initiatives for companies. For example, by sharing best practices, we need to prioritize the bolstering of the market. Being from a private financial institution, I agree with what Mr. Kuwata said about relying on the strengths of the private sector and that we ultimately have to help ourselves. We look forward to your advice as we strive to bolster our efforts through public-private cooperation. We're running out of time, but I'd like you to answer questions from the floor. You've already answered some of the questions, so I'll quickly summarize other questions. We've received feedback from people at business firms saying it's difficult for individual companies to work on their own, or how much are companies which don't emit large quantities of CO2 expected to do? I'd like Mr. Kuwata to answer this question. Someone wants to know what will happen to carbon tax, for which there is great interest throughout society. I'd like Mr. Kondo and Mr. Kajikawa to answer this. Before, Mr. Kuwata talked about promoting the initiative locally, and I'd like to know what business firms should do in the future. I think it's important to adapt the initiative to the type and characteristics of the industry the company is involved in. That's a main point of revised corporate governance code, based on the principle of comply or explain. In dealing with something vague and uncertain, such as climate change, you can't expect all companies and industries to aim for and realize the same goal. I think companies should implement measures according to their size. But when you set a goal and attain it, you may lose your motivation to go beyond it. So, we will encourage companies to aim for even higher goals. I agree that it's impossible for individual companies to work on their own. They'll need to cooperate with other companies through the TCFD Kanso. Kanso is short for consortium, right? I'm hearing lots of new terms today. I'd like to ask Mr. Kondo about carbon tax. We're currently at the stage where we've resumed discussions on carbon tax as a tool, and not whether we should introduce it or not. We are not considering whether to introduce the tax or not, but there is a need to examine the cases in other countries where carbon tax has already been introduced and consider the meaning of introducing the tool in Japan. For example, climate change is considered in connection with financial information under the TCFD framework. One of the most straightforward ways of doing this is to introduce carbon tax or carbon pricing. Carbon tax is attracting interest, but there are diverse opinions, so the policy direction has yet to be set. We believe carbon tax must assist the growth of industries. What do you think, Mr. Kajikawa? I'm the person in direct charge of carbon pricing to assist the growth of industries, so I'd like to add to this a little. In formulating the Green Growth Strategy last year, Prime Minister Suga instructed the Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Minister of the Environment to look into carbon pricing to assist the growth of industries. The two ministries are currently engaged in cooperation and discussions. This isn't simply about carbon tax or cap and trade. We need to hold discussions with the purpose of judging what is competitive for industries among a variety of forms of carbon pricing, including the carbon credit trading and border adjustment tax. In doing so, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry expects trading in carbon credits to expand greatly. This will be due to an increasing number of companies commit to carbon neutrality, as well as an increasing number of methods for carbon pricing in ESG investing. There's a need for the government to look into what else it can do in response to such actions within the private sector. Conventionally, carbon was seen as a troublesome goods, and the government puts a negative price on it, and the cost was internalized by companies. Now, the government doesn't put a pre-designated price on carbon, but companies put a price on it of their own accord, giving birth to the market for trading carbon credits. This is what led to discussions on carbon tax, as the situation diversified through demand for trading from the supply chain and changes in the financial market. Nothing has been decided yet, as Mr. Kondo mentioned earlier, but these are the main points of our discussions on carbon tax. I think carbon pricing to assist the growth of industries is a good forward-looking idea. One of the audience expressed concern that we try to reduce emissions so much that Japan may end up exporting carbon, but I think you answered this question indirectly. There is so much to discuss, but we're running out of time, so I'd like to finish with one last question. COP26 will be held this year, and I'd like a word from each of you on what your aspirations are. I'd also like to ask the floor to send all additional questions to the Secretariat. I'd like comments from Mr. Kajikawa, Mr. Kuwata, and Mr. Kondo in that order. I've said just about everything I need to say, but of the TGIF, I will focus particularly on I for innovation. How can we provide financing for it in the future? This is what will drive growth in Japan. Mr. Kuwata? Addressing climate change faces many challenges, such as the promotion of initiatives and need for long-term measures. We've only just begun our efforts, so the three parties will work together and cooperate with the private sector through sustained efforts. Final words from you, Mr. Kondo? To realize carbon neutrality, it's important to create a situation in which local communities and individuals can feel optimistic about it. There is still more we can do through financing with cooperation among the three parties. Thank you. We received questions from the floor on overseas trends, but listening to the three speakers today has made me realize that you're all keeping a close eye on overseas trends. I also have great expectations for your initiatives to create synergy in aiming to realize decarbonization. We have a long way to go, but we hope you keep up the great work. I'd also like to thank the floor for their interest and attention. This brings us to the end of our discussions. Thank you very much.